You have done it again. Someone questioned your decision, and you explained it. Someone raised an eyebrow, and you justified yourself. Someone went quiet, and you filled the silence with reasons. And the moment you finished, you felt it. That familiar drop. The power shifted. It always does when you explain yourself to someone who did not deserve the explanation. The most powerful men you have ever observed share one quality that is almost never discussed. Not their intelligence, not their confidence, not their resources. It is this: they do not explain themselves. Not because they are arrogant, not because they do not care, because they have understood something that took most men their entire lives to learn. Every explanation you offer unprompted is a transfer of power, and the man who keeps transferring power eventually has none left. What you are about to hear is not about becoming cold or dismissive. It is about understanding the precise mechanism by which explanation destroys authority, why the need to justify yourself is a signal that something deeper needs to change, and how the most formidable men in history built reputations so solid that their decisions required no defense. That is what this is about. There is a specific psychology behind the compulsion to explain. Dr. Leon Festinger at Stanford University identified the mechanism in his research on cognitive dissonance in 1957. When a person takes an action that conflicts with how they see themselves, or anticipates that others might judge that action negatively, the brain generates discomfort. Explanation is the brain's attempt to resolve that discomfort. You explain not primarily to inform the other person. You explain to relieve your own internal tension. The explanation is for you. And in delivering it, you reveal that the tension exists. That revelation is what costs you. Because what you are communicating when you explain an unprompted justification is not the content of the explanation. You are communicating that you need the other person's approval to feel settled, that their judgment of your decision matters enough to alter your behavior, that you are, in this moment, more concerned with how they see you than with the decision itself. And that information is far more significant to a perceptive person than anything in the explanation. Dr. Robert Cialdini at Arizona State University documented what he called the authority heuristic across decades of research on social influence. His finding was consistent. When a person behaves as though their decisions require no defense, others unconsciously assign them higher competence, higher status, and higher trustworthiness. Not because the unexplained decision is necessarily better, because the willingness to stand behind a decision without seeking approval reads as deep confidence. And deep confidence, whether earned or performed, triggers the same response in the people observing it. Think about the dynamic that plays out in a boardroom, a negotiation, or any room where status is being continuously assessed. Two men make the same decision. The first, when questioned, leans forward and begins explaining his reasoning in detail. The second looks at the questioner, gives a single direct answer, and moves on. The room does not evaluate the quality of those explanations equally. The room evaluates the confidence behind them. And the second man, regardless of whether his decision is actually better, has communicated something the first man has not. He has communicated that the decision is not on trial. And that communication happens before a word of substance is spoken. Marcus Aurelius governed Rome for 19 years. In that time, he made thousands of decisions that affected millions of people. His critics were vocal, his enemies were numerous, and the pressure to justify his choices was constant. His journals contain almost nothing about how he explained himself to others. They contain page after page about how he explained himself to himself. The internal audit, the private standard, the question of whether his decisions aligned with his values, not whether they satisfied his critics. He was answerable to one audience, and that audience wasn't Rome. Principle 1. Explanation signals doubt. Silence signals certainty. In 2003, Dr. Nalini Ambady at Tufts University published research on what she called thin slice judgments, the rapid assessments people make about others based on brief exposures to their behavior. Her finding was precise. Within seconds of observing someone respond to a challenge, observers formed judgments about that person's competence and authority that remained stable even after extended interaction. The first response to a challenge is not just a social moment. It is a data point that sets the frame for everything that follows. When a man's first response to a question about his decision is an explanation, the thin slice judgment is immediate and unfavorable. The observer reads anxiety. They read a need for validation. They read a man who is not fully behind what he did. None of this is fair. None of it is necessarily accurate. But it is the automatic, unconscious assessment that happens before the content of the explanation is even processed. You lose the frame before you finish the first sentence. Compare this to the man who responds to a challenge with a slight pause, a direct look, and either a single sentence or nothing at all. That thin slice reads completely differently. It reads as a man who made his decision, knows why he made it, and does not require your agreement to remain comfortable with it. That reading generates respect before a single word of substance has been exchanged. Because confidence is not communicated through argument. It is communicated through the absence of the need to argue. The Roman Emperor Tiberius, who succeeded Augustus, was known for one communication pattern above all others. When his decisions were challenged in the Senate, he would look at the speaker, say nothing for a long moment, and then either change the subject or make a statement that addressed none of the criticism directly. Senators found this maddening and deeply unsettling, because the refusal to engage with the challenge implicitly elevated the decision above the challenge. The silence said what no argument could say. This matter is settled. Principle 2. The need to explain yourself reveals what you have not yet resolved inside. Dr. Kristen Neff at the University of Texas at Austin spent years researching the relationship between self-compassion and the need for external validation. Her finding reframed how psychologists think about defensiveness. The compulsion to justify yourself to others is not primarily a social behavior. It is an internal one. It emerges most powerfully in the areas where a man has not yet fully accepted his own decisions. The explanation is directed outward, but it is generated inward by a part of the self that is not yet settled. This is why the solution to over-explanation is not a communication technique. It is internal work. The man who has genuinely examined his decision, weighed it against his values, accepted the trade-offs honestly, and committed to it without reservation, does not feel the pull to explain it. The pull disappears when the internal process is complete. When you feel compelled to explain, the signal is not that the other person needs information. The signal is that you have not yet finished the internal conversation. There is a test for this that requires total honesty. Think of the last time you explained yourself extensively. Now, remove the other person from the equation entirely. Imagine they were not there. Would the explanation still have been necessary? In almost every case, the answer is no. The explanation was a performance staged for an audience of one, which was not them. It was you. You were trying to convince yourself, and the audience you actually needed to address was internal all along. Epictetus taught that the only domain a man truly controls is his own judgments, his own responses, and his own choices. His central discipline was not the management of external circumstances, but the completion of internal ones. Before any significant action, the Stoic practice was to examine the action fully, accept its consequences honestly, and commit to it completely. A decision made through that process needs no external defense, because the man who made it is already at peace with it. The explanation hunger disappears when the internal work is done. The next time you feel the urge to explain a decision, stop and ask yourself one question. Am I explaining because they need this information, or am I explaining because I am not yet fully settled with what I did? The honest answer to that question is more useful than anything you were about to say. Principle 3. Your reputation is built by what you do, destroyed by what you justify. Dr. Daniel Kahneman at Princeton University, Nobel Prize winner in economics in 2002, documented what he called the narrative fallacy in his research on how people form judgments about others. His finding was that people do not evaluate others based on the logical quality of their explanations. They evaluate them based on the story those explanations tell about the person's character. And a man who explains himself frequently tells a very specific story. He tells the story of a man who needs to be understood, who is managed by others' perceptions, whose confidence has a ceiling defined by the approval of his audience. Reputation is built through a different mechanism entirely. It is built through the accumulated observation of how a man behaves when no explanation is required, and how he stands when challenged without defending. Every time you make a decision and hold it without justifying it to the people around you, you add a layer to a reputation that eventually becomes self-reinforcing. People stop challenging decisions that are never defended, not because they agree, because they have learned that the challenge will not produce the result they are looking for. Andrew Carnegie, who built the largest steel empire in American history, was known for a specific quality in his leadership. When subordinates pushed back on his decisions, he would listen completely without interrupting, acknowledge that he had heard them, and then proceed exactly as he had planned, unless the new information genuinely changed the calculus. Not out of stubbornness, out of a clear separation between input, which was always welcome, and approval, which was never required. His people learned quickly that disagreement was listened to, and explanation was unnecessary. That clarity created an environment of unusual efficiency and unusual loyalty. The inverse of this is equally true and equally important. The man who is known for holding his positions without justifying them, and who then occasionally chooses to explain something, produces a completely different effect. Because the explanation is rare, it carries enormous weight. People lean in. They pay close attention. They treat it as signal rather than noise. The man who explains everything trains people to hear nothing. The man who explains rarely trains people to listen completely when he speaks. The economy of explanation is the economy of authority. Principle 4. The more you explain, the less they believe you. Dr. Nero Sivanathan at London Business School, whose research on the dilution effect you encountered in EP04, extended his findings into the specific domain of trust. His research showed that when a person provides more justification than a situation requires, listeners do not update their trust upward. They update it downward. The brain interprets excessive explanation as a signal that the person explaining does not fully believe what they are saying. Because a man who is certain does not need to convince you. Only a man who is uncertain needs you to be persuaded. This effect is most visible in situations involving credibility. A doctor who explains at length why a diagnosis is correct before you have questioned it produces doubt, not confidence. A lawyer who volunteers reasons why their argument is sound before the opposing side has challenged it signals weakness, not strength. An executive who explains every decision to every stakeholder creates an expectation of explanation that permanently shifts the power dynamic. Once you have established the pattern of explaining, the absence of explanation becomes suspicious. You have trained people to expect justification, and now silence reads as evasion. The pattern is reversible, but it requires consistency. Every time you hold a position without justifying it, you are rebuilding the frame. Every time you respond to a challenge with a question rather than a defense, you reestablish who is directing the conversation. Every time you let a silence sit without filling it with reasons, you reclaim ground that explanation had surrendered. The accumulation of these moments over weeks and months produces a fundamentally different perception of who you are and what you represent. Principle 5. Silence under pressure is a skill. Build it deliberately. Dr. Roy Baumeister at Florida State University, whose research on self-regulation defined much of modern psychology, documented the specific mechanism by which silence under social pressure breaks down. His finding was that the impulse to explain under pressure draws on the same resource as all other forms of self-control. When that resource is depleted by the demands of the situation, the impulse wins. The explanation comes out before the decision to withhold it can be enforced. This means that silence under pressure is not just a decision, it is a capacity. And like all capacities, it is built through practice. The man who practices withholding explanation in low-stakes situations, who trains himself to pause before responding, who builds the habit of asking rather than justifying, develops a reserve of that capacity that holds under high-pressure conditions. The training is not dramatic. It is 1,000 small moments where the explanation was possible and you chose differently. The specific training protocol is simple. Every day this week, identify one moment where the pull to explain is present and do not act on it. Not dramatically, not visibly, just internally register the pull, note it, and let it pass without expression. The first time, the discomfort will feel significant. By the 5th time, it will feel manageable. By the 30th time, the pull will be weaker at the source, because the neural pathway that connects challenge to justification is being rerouted, not by force, by repetition of the alternative. The Stoic practice of voluntary discomfort applies directly here. Epictetus recommended deliberately placing yourself in situations where the pull to explain was strong and practicing the withholding, not as suppression, which is effortful and visible, but as non-engagement. The question or the challenge simply does not activate the justification mechanism because you have trained the gap between stimulus and response to be wide enough for a choice. That gap, built through practice, is the actual location of your authority. Winston Churchill was famous in cabinet meetings for a practice his ministers described as deeply uncomfortable. When a minister presented a position that Churchill disagreed with, he would not argue. He would ask a single question, look out the window, and say nothing further. The minister was left with two options: defend their position against silence, which felt increasingly exposed the longer it went on, or revise their position, which most of them eventually did. Churchill won more arguments through strategic silence than through any of the formidable rhetoric he was equally capable of deploying. Principle 6. What you refuse to defend becomes what others defend for you. There is a counterintuitive effect that emerges when a man consistently refuses to defend his decisions. The people around him begin to defend those decisions instead, not because they were convinced by an argument, because the absence of defensiveness signals such complete confidence that observers begin to fill in the justification themselves. The brain, encountering certainty without explanation, generates its own explanation. And the explanation it generates is almost always more favorable than anything the man could have provided himself. Dr. Robert Cialdini documented this as a component of the social proof mechanism. When one person behaves as if something is obviously correct and requires no defense, others unconsciously begin treating it as obviously correct. The behavior transfers the burden of proof from the actor to the observer. Instead of the man proving his decision was right, the observer begins working to understand why a man this confident would make such a decision. The frame has inverted completely, and the man achieved that inversion by saying nothing. Steve Jobs was studied extensively for this dynamic in his product presentations and internal meetings. When challenged on a design decision, he would look at the challenger without expression and say simply that this is how it is going to be. No explanation, no defense, no engagement with the challenge at all. His teams reported that this response, over time, stopped generating pushback entirely. Not because people agreed, because they had learned that the absence of defense wasn't an opening for negotiation. It was a closing of the discussion. And the reputation behind that silence did the work that arguments never could. This dynamic is observable in every high-functioning organization and every high-functioning relationship. The person who holds their position without defending it eventually sets the standard that everyone else positions themselves relative to. Not through force, through consistency. The gravitational pull of a settled, unexplained position is more powerful than any argument, because it cannot be argued with. There is no opening. There is no vulnerability. There is simply a man who knows what he thinks, acts accordingly, and requires nothing from you in response. That combination is rarer than any particular skill or achievement, and it is more influential than either. Principle 7. The man who is answerable only to himself becomes the man others answer to. The final principle ties every previous one together. The man who has internalized his own standards so completely that external judgment becomes irrelevant does not just stop explaining himself. He becomes the reference point that others use to evaluate themselves. This is not a goal you pursue directly. It is the result of the internal work done consistently over time. The reputation that builds when decisions are made without defense and held without apology eventually creates a gravitational field. People orient themselves relative to where you stand. Dr. Adam Grant at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania studied what he called disagreeable givers in organizational research. These were individuals who combined high concern for others with a complete unwillingness to seek approval. His data showed that this profile, rare in organizations, produced the highest ratings of trustworthiness and the most genuine influence. Not because people liked them most, because people knew exactly where they stood. The absence of approval seeking created a predictability and solidity that people with higher social agreeableness never achieved because their positions shifted with the social wind. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journals, in one of the most direct statements in the entire 12 books, that he had no desire to be admired for qualities he did not have, and no concern for the opinion of those who did not understand his actual qualities. He was not dismissing the world. He was simply clear about who he was answerable to. That clarity, maintained under the continuous pressure of running an empire, is what made him the most admired leader of the ancient world 2,000 years after his death. Not because he sought admiration, because he did not. Here's what you apply starting today. The first action is to identify the last 3 times you explained yourself without being asked. Write down who you explained yourself to, what you explained, and what you were actually seeking when you did it. That audit will show you the exact relationships and contexts where you are leaking authority most consistently. The second action is to practice the single-sentence response. When challenged this week, respond with 1 sentence maximum. Not a paragraph, not a series of reasons. 1 sentence that addresses the challenge at the level of your decision, not at the level of your reasoning. Then stop. Let the silence work. The third action is to complete your internal conversation before your next significant decision. Before you decide, examine it fully. Accept the trade-offs honestly. Commit to it without reservation. A decision that has been fully processed internally produces no explanation hunger. The urge to justify only arrives when the internal work is incomplete. The fourth action is to use a question instead of a defense the next time someone challenges your position. Not a rhetorical question, a genuine one. What would change your view on this? Or what specifically concerns you? A question redirects the conversation, gathers information, and demonstrates that you are engaging from a position of curiosity rather than anxiety. It is both more effective and more honest than a defense. The fifth action is to hold one position this week that you would normally have softened or explained away under pressure. Not aggressively, not dramatically. Simply hold it. Let the discomfort of being misunderstood sit without resolving it with words. Notice that the discomfort passes. Notice that the relationship survives. Notice what remains when you stop managing everyone else's understanding of you. There is a final thing worth naming directly. The fear underneath all of this. The fear that if you stop explaining, people will misunderstand you. They will judge you incorrectly. They will form opinions about your decisions that do not reflect your actual reasoning. That fear is real, and it is also irrelevant, because the people who matter, the ones whose judgment you should actually care about, do not require your explanation. They watch your pattern over time. They assess your decisions by their results. They form their opinion of you through the accumulation of observed behavior, not through the content of your justifications. The people who require your explanation before they will respect you are precisely the people whose respect costs the most and delivers the least. The man who never explains himself is not the man who has nothing to say. He is the man who has learned that his decisions speak louder than his justifications ever could. That his consistency over time builds more credibility than any single argument. That the most powerful statement he can make in any room is the one he makes by saying nothing and remaining completely certain of where he stands. The next video is already loaded. It covers the 7 laws that rewire how your mind processes challenge, pressure, and adversity at the structural level. Not tactics. Architecture. Watch it now.